All right, this is Numbers 30 in the MacArthur Study Bible and the Prager Rational Bible. Let's begin. A little refresher. 29. Basically, 29 was just the offerings for the different feasts, like the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, and the eighth day of Assembly. All right. And just offering the bulls and the rams and the lambs, all of that. All right, well, chapter 30, the law concerning vows. And then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word, and he shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Or if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself by some agreement while in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and the agreement by which she has bound herself, and her father holds his peace, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement with which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father overrules her on the day that he hears, then none of her vows nor her agreements by which she has bound herself shall stand. The Lord will release her, because her father has overruled her. If indeed she takes a husband while bound by her vows, or by a rash utterance from her lips by which she bound herself, and her husband hears it and makes no response to her on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand, and her agreements by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband overrules her on the day that he hears it, he shall make void her vow with which she took it, and what she uttered with her lips, by which she bound herself, and the Lord will release her. Also any vow of a widow or a divorced woman by which she bound herself shall stand against her. And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by an agreement with an oath, and her husband heard it and made no response to her, and did not overrule her, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband truly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatever proceeded from her lips concerning her vows, or concerning the agreement binding her, it shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will release her, and every vow and even every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may make it void. Now if her husband makes no response whatever to her from day to day, then he confirms all of her vows or the agreements that bind her. He confirms them because he made no response to her on the day that he heard them. But if he does make them void after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. These are the statutes with which the Lord commanded Moses, between a man and his wife, and between a father and his daughter, in her youth in her father's house. Okay, there's not very many notes here. I'll just go ahead and read those, and then I'll move on to Prager. So this chapter added some clarification to the laws regarding vows that are given in Leviticus 27. And there's only 27 chapters in Leviticus, so that's the very last one. So the basic principle for men is restated in verse 2. Then it was asserted that a man was also responsible for the vows made by women in his household. A father and a husband or husband could overrule the vow of a daughter or wife, but a man's silence, if he knew of the vow, meant that it must be accomplished. And a vow ultimately is a promise to do something or a promise not to do something. Christ could have had this in mind whenever he said, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." and anything else is of the evil one. So basically, you make a vow, you better keep it. And then in verse 9, it mentions any vow of a widow or a divorced woman, if by which she bound herself, shall stand against her. So now these were not viewed as being under a man's authority, so even the word of a woman alone also sufficed. But ultimately, a woman makes a vow to the Lord, ultimately, and the man or whatever doesn't disavow it or whatever, doesn't overrule, then the woman would have to keep the vow. Alright, and that's pretty much what it says. So, keep the vow in the father's household unless he overrules it, or if the husband overrules it, basically. Okay, well, that's the end of MacArthur. Alright, now for Prager. So, here's a little bit of a note before the chapter begins. So, note to reader, the Jewish enumeration of the verses in chapter 30 is one ahead of other versions. So, verse 1 is actually the last verse in 29 for the Christian Bibles. So, it would actually be 29:40, but instead it's going to be 30 verse 1. So, the Jewish one's one verse ahead than the Christian one. And then in the commentary, the latter enumeration is in the brackets, and I might say some of those as I go. And it seems to me that the latter enumeration makes more sense, since verse 1 serves as a concluding statement of the previous chapter. It really should be the concluding verse to the previous chapter. And since verse 2 begins the content of chapter 30, well, then it should be verse 1. Well, maybe that's why. Maybe you have that to be the case in the Christian translations. And on another personal note, one other note is a personal one, sorry. Jews read the entire Torah in their synagogues over the course of each year. However, because there are 54 portions on some Sabbaths each non-leap year, 2 portions are read. Chapters 30 through 36, the last chapters of the book of Numbers, comprise 2 Torah portions, Matot and Messai, however you say that. And they are one of the double portions. Together they constitute the longest of all Torah readings. And as luck would have it, my 13th Hebrew birthday fell on the week these 2 portions were the Sabbath reading. Okay, given that Torah scrolls have no punctuation and no vowels and no musical notation, chanting from the Torah is quite a challenge, but that was what was expected of me on my bar mitzvah after 2 full years of practice, and I chanted both portions, 5 chapters, 248 verses without mistake. Wow, these last few chapters? Wow, cool. When I completed the reading, my father, who had supervised my preparation, he turned to me and he said, "Good job." Veterans of World War II combat were not known for giving their children, effusive praise, and that probably produced less narcissistic and more resilient adults than effusive praise. Okay. Alright, verse 1 for the Jews, but 29:40 for Christians. So Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord commanded Moses. And then 2, and then 1. Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribes, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded." So this is a rare instance of Moses, rather than God, giving instructions to the Israelites. Alright, essay. The seriousness of uttering oaths. Alright. Verse 3 or 2. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath, imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. So the vows and oaths in this chapter, they don't refer to courtroom procedures, but to personal vows between an individual and God. Vows in the Bible are conditional. If you, God, will do this, then I will do that. And the first vow recorded in the Bible was an example of a conditional vow between an individual and God. Jacob, fleeing his brother Esau, vowed to God in Genesis 28, verses 20 through 22, if I return safe to my father's house, ... of all that you give me, I shall return and set aside a tithe for you. I guess I didn't have all of it quoted. But a well-known example of such vows is that of a soldier in battle. If you, God, let me leave this battle alive in one piece, I will ... Given how seriously the Torah regards words, the Hebrew word for words is also the word for things, devarim, however you say that. Because words are things, one can infer how seriously the Torah regards vows. If you vow to do something, even if no one but God knows about it, which is often the case, you are expected to fulfill it. In the words of the psalmist, a righteous person stands by his oath, even when it is to his disadvantage. So there's a footnote there. So what psalm is that? Psalm 15:4. Based on the Torah, later Judaism came to regard vows so seriously that the opening prayer of the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, is Kol Nedre, which is all the vows. And this prayer is a public proclamation made by the members of the congregation that any religious vows they will make in the upcoming year not be regarded as binding, lest an unfulfilled vow hinder a Jew's being worthy of atonement. Okay? Kol Nedre has nothing to do with promises of obligations to fellow human beings. It in no way annuls a Jew's promise to repay a debt, for example. And regarding vows, the parental advice to children, think before you speak, is the governing principle. As Deuteronomy states, whereas you incur no guilt if you refrain from vowing, you must fulfill what has crossed your lips and perform what you have voluntarily vowed, having made the promise with your own mouth. Deuteronomy 23, verses 23 through 24. As Ecclesiastes states, it's better to not make a vow at all than to vow and not fulfill. Ecclesiastes 5:4. And as Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Telushkin notes that to modern ears, the Bible's concern with fulfilling what one swears to do almost sounds quaint. People often utter oaths that they are extremely unlikely to fulfill. For example, they might say after eating too much, I swear to God I'll never stuff myself like that again. Yeah. And then they overeat the next time they go to a restaurant or they partake of a holiday meal. And the phrase translated here as imposing an obligation on himself literally means or creates a prohibition on his soul. And the Torah is likely referring to some religious commitment, as when people in a desire to become more pious pledge to observe stringencies over and above demands made in the Torah. And the Torah and the later Jewish law discourages people from taking on more obligations or deprivations than God had already ordained. In the words of the Talmud, is it not enough what the Torah has forbidden you? You wish to forbid yourself more things? And Maimonides incorporated this view into his code of Jewish law. No one should by vows or oaths forbid himself the use of things otherwise permitted. See the essay Why People Add and Subtract from God's Laws, Deuteronomy 13:1, which you're not supposed to do that, by the way. Yeah, and some of the references there, the Jewish Talmud, Nadarim, however you say that, 9:1, and then Maimonides, Laws of Character Development 3:1. Okay. But if one has done so, as the next verse makes clear, he's obligated to fulfill his vow, if you make a vow. Alright. An oath is an oath only when expressed, not merely thought. So you make a vow, and he must carry out all that has crossed his lips. He shall not break his pledge. So the Torah repeatedly emphasizes that only pledges and oaths that one actually states out loud must be fulfilled. And thinking about an oath does not count as an oath. This is an example of one of the most important principles of the Torah. Thoughts are not the moral equivalent of deeds. Well, unless it's lust, because lust is considered to be adultery. Yeah, or coveting. That's another thing. But ultimately, yeah, thoughts, I guess in this case, thinking about an oath is not the same as you actually making an oath. So good thoughts are not the moral equivalent of good deeds. Bad thoughts are not the equivalent of bad deeds, although they're both bad. Yeah, here it is. The only exception is coveting, desiring to steal what belongs to another person, and lusting, which is adultery. This is the one thought sin in the Ten Commandments, and for that matter in the Torah. And see the explanation of the 10th commandment at Exodus 20:14 and Deuteronomy 5:18. Alright, verse 4 or 3. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by any reason of her youth, and her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation, and he offers no objection, all her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. So in ancient times and in all societies until recently, nearly all unmarried females lived in their father's home under his jurisdiction. And according to rabbinic law, parents are held responsible for their children's actions until the age of bar or bat mitzvah, 13. After that, God holds the individual responsible for his or her behavior. Serious human punishment for criminal acts was not imposed until a later age. Okay. By reason of her youth, repeated at the end of the chapter, may be an accurate translation of the Hebrew benuria, however you say that. But the word more likely describes whenever it is that a woman is young enough to still be in her father's home, but old enough to utter a vow that's legally binding. So in her youth, which probably describes her teens. So maybe being a teenager, but she utters a vow even though she's still in her father's house, but yet the vow can be binding. Okay. However, the woman's precise age is not stipulated. Yep. And the vows made by a female are as obligatory as those of a male, with two exceptions. One, if her father, as we'll see in verse 7, or her husband, upon learning about the vow, immediately intervenes to annul it. Women who live alone, and most obviously widows and divorcees, are obligated as men to fulfill a vow. So 6 or 5. But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her, since her father restrained her. So a woman's vow could be annulled by her father while she's single and living in his home, or even annulled by her husband. And this law is not about male or female equality or inequality. It is a given that men and women are equal. It is about the patriarchal nature of the Israelite home. Outside of the home, no man can annul the vow of a woman living on her own. The words on the day he finds out, they mean that if a father wants to annul his daughter's vow, he must do so immediately. The Torah thereby limits a father's authority over his daughter. And this verse may be another example of the Torah's evolutionary rather than revolutionary approach to social change. And this was talked about in chapter 27, a moral evolution or immoral revolution. You can go check that out for 27. Rather than completely overthrow a father's or husband's authority, the Torah severely limited it. And these laws concerning women's vows reflect a society in which men governed their households. And at the same time, however, women did possess one advantage. Under such circumstances, as set forth in this verse, a female's vow could be annulled, but there was no Torah provision to annul a male's vow. And as a result, the problem of men who later regretted the vow that they made became so severe that the rabbis created a legal procedure to release men or women from their vows. A learned scholar or any three competent Jews could release a person from a vow if it were determined that when making the vow, the individual did not realize how arduous it would be to fulfill it. And there's kind of an example where somebody makes a horrible vow in the Bible. Jephthah, the judge, he makes a vow to the Lord. Yeah, I'm trying to remember that basically, if he helps him win in battle, he'll give a sacrifice to him. But whoever, comes out of the house or whatever. But it turns out to be his daughter. And, he ends up keeping that vow, unfortunately, even though he shouldn't have made it in the first place. Yeah, so that's just an example of a pretty bad vow. But it was still a vow, though, but it was a bad one. All right, verse 7 or 6. If she should marry while her vow or the commitment to which she bound herself is still in force, and her husband learns of it and offers no objection on the day he finds out, her vows shall stand, and her self-imposed obligations shall stand. So a careful reading of this verse suggests that a husband can annul a vow with his wife. Can annul a vow of his wife only if she made that vow before they were married, while she was living in her father's house. Annulment of vows and women's equality. Verse 9 or 8. But if a husband restrains her on the day that he learns it, he thereby annuls her vow which was in force, or the commitment to which she bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. So many moderns cite the ability of a father to annul the vow of a young daughter or husband to annul the vow of a wife as examples of the Torah's endorsing women's inequality. To this I would offer three responses. First, the Torah unambiguously asserts that men and women are equal, both being created in God's image. Indeed, as creation goes from primitive to advanced, the argument can be made that, since woman is the final creation, she may be the highest creation. Women in the Torah are depicted as being strong as, and sometimes even stronger than men, as wise, and even sometimes wiser than men. For example, Rebecca in Genesis 25, and then also sometimes women are, Heroni, Heronis, heroines. There we go, heroines. See, for example, Tamar in Genesis 38 and the daughter of Pharaoh in Exodus 2. Indeed, as noted previously, a woman, Miriam, is one of only 3 people that the Torah calls prophet. The others are Abraham and Moses. Second, the Torah's prescriptions concerning vow annulment are as symbolic as they are real. And I say that because a father's or husband's ability to annul the vow of a young daughter or a wife is severely limited to the moment that he finds out about the vow, and in the case of a daughter, to her youth. Third, the Torah does not endorse the idea within moral and religious bounds. It is best for men, women in society, when men are regarded as the head of the household, although they should be. Living at a time when most men have no such aspiration, a strong case can be made that women in society as a whole are a lot worse off when men abandon that aspiration and that role. Agreed. At the time of this writing, fewer men are marrying than ever before, and women are finding it more difficult to find suitable men to marry. And this, in turn, has led both men and women being lonelier and less happy than at any time since such data were first recorded. And this is not only true for America, but for most developed countries. It is not only because society has rejected female roles, but it is a major factor. And here's some, statistics here. In 1960, single-person households accounted for only 13% of all U.S. households. 2022, that number has more than doubled to 29% of all households. Yeah, that comes from the Census Bureau releases new estimates on America's families and living arrangements reports, United States Census Bureau 2022. And as of 2021, 25% of 40-year-olds in the United States have never been married. This was a significant increase from 20% in 2010. And this comes from Pew Research Center of Census Bureau data, June 28, 2023. Some of the highest rates of loneliness are among young adults. Epidemic of loneliness, isolation. 2023 U.S. Surgeon General's advisory on the health effects of social connection and community. William Nera, marriage rates in Germany reach all-time lows. I am Expot, May 3rd, 2022, and then it gives just the website, and some more of the citation, but just the URL there. But I'm not going to read all that. Just some more of that. Okay, and then also another citation. Women really not being as happier. The people not really being very happy. See, for example, and Petherick, gains in women's rights haven't made women happier. Feminism has not helped women. Why is that? And that comes from The Guardian. May 18, 2016. Well, probably ultimately why is that? I think is because feminism is rejecting God's roles for the man to be the head of the household, and of course the woman to be a caretaker at home in Titus 2. Yeah, and the woman to submit to the man and the man submits to Christ. When that's ultimately undone, you get chaos as a result, and I think ultimately you get this unhappiness and loneliness also. Yeah, things would go so much better if we only did what the Bible says. Alright, verse 10 or 9. The vow of a widow of a divorced woman, however, whatever she has imposed on herself shall be binding upon her. So if a woman is not married or living under her father's jurisdiction, no man has the power to annul her vows. The vows of a widowed or divorced woman are therefore no different than the vows of a man. So too, if while in her husband's household she makes a vow or imposes an obligation on herself by oath, and her husband learns of it, yet offers no objection, thus failing to restrain her, all her vows shall stand, and all her self-imposed obligations shall stand. But if her husband does annul them on the day he finds out, then nothing that has crossed her lips shall stand, whether vows or self-imposed obligations. Her husband has annulled them, and the Lord will forgive her. Every vow and every sworn obligation of self-denial may be upheld by her husband or annulled by her husband. The Hebrew translated here as obligation of self-denial literally means a prohibition of a thing or action in order to afflict the soul. This same phrase is used in the Torah's description of Yom Kippur, a day to afflict your souls, Numbers 29:7. Though this verse is not passing judgment on vows or of self-denial, vows of self-denial, the Torah teaches that self-affliction should be limited to one day of the year. And the Torah does not agree with those religious people who believe that they will become closer to God by prohibiting themselves of pleasure. Yeah, as long as it's not sinful pleasure. Okay. Very end of the chapter. I guess I should have waited. Yep, but looks like Prager's going to talk about this when I get to the end. How about that? Alright, verse 15 or 14. If her husband offers no objection from that day to the next, he has upheld all the vows or obligations she has assumed. He has upheld them by offering no objection on the day he found out. But if he annuls them after the day he finds out, he shall bear her guilt. And then verse 17 or 16. These are the laws that the Lord enjoined upon Moses between a man and his wife, as between a father and his daughter while in her father's household by reason of her youth. So as this ends the Torah's discussion of vows, it's worth noting a general principle about vows. Vows that involve violating the Torah or a Torah law are never binding. To cite an obvious example, if a person in dispute says, "I swear to God I'm going to kill him," it's considered as if no vow were made. And one might assume that this is self-evident, but it isn't. And now he's going to bring up Jephthah. Yeah, which I talked about Jephthah a little bit earlier. But I know I didn't quite remember everything, but Prager will help me out with that if I got it wrong. Let's see. Shortly before battle, between Israel and Ammon, Jephthah, he foolishly believed that all oaths were binding. And of course, he was one of the judges in the book of Judges. but he led the Israelites into battle against the Ammonites, but he vowed that if God granted the Israelites victory upon returning home, he would sacrifice to God the first living thing that would come out of his house. Yes. And Jephthah undoubtedly expected some animal to emerge out of his house, but the one who came out of his house first when he got back from battle was his daughter, whom he felt obliged to sacrifice. Yeah, and I think some have debated whether or not Jephthah actually literally sacrificed his daughter to the Lord, where he did that literally, or maybe he just gave her into ministry or something. Yep, and in fact, she even believed that her father actually must honor his vow, and I think I remember he sent her away for like a few months, basically to mourn over her virginity or something like that. And then she comes back, and then he honors that vow. And I think Jephthah's heart was maybe in the right place when wanting to make a vow to the Lord. Yeah, but But I don't think he should have said that. Maybe he should have said something else. That would not have been, tragic. And then there's a citation. It's Judges 11:31. All right. Well, that's all of chapter 30 for both of those. Sweet. It was under 40 minutes. Awesome. Well, Lord willing, another time I'll get to 31. But until then, may God bless you in the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.